So good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to today's presentation. We're going to be launching the Development in the Americas Report 2020, which is a yearly publication published by the Research Department here at the IDB. My name is Giles Álvarez. I'm Country Economist for the IDB in Barbados. And with me today, I have the absolute pleasure of welcoming Andrew Powell, who's Principal Advisor in the Research Department, Eduardo Cavallo, Principal Economist at the Research Department, Tomás Rebrisky, Principal Economic Advisor at the Infrastructure and Energy Departments at IDB, and finally, our guest, Daniel Best, Director of Projects at the Caribbean Development Bank. Welcome, everybody, and we'll first pass on to some words from the country representative, Juan Carlos de la Hoz.
Thank you, Laura. And initially, I would like to thank my distinguished colleagues from IDB and Daniel, a very strong partnership with CDB, always to deliver services here in Barbados. All we know that high quality infrastructure is essential for long-term growth and development. And this is particularly important here in Barbados, and this is the focus of our discussion today. We have been very eager to align our country strategy to heavy investment in infrastructure as a way to foster development and as a way to align our objectives to this long-term idea of infrastructure as a vehicle for long-term growth. And in fact, we have a very heavy portfolio that is focused on infrastructure, mainly energy. We have been working with the government to finance public lighting, solar PVs, now hopefully wind and energy efficiency in different sectors. Also roads rehabilitation, as anyone driving around Barbados, we understand that aging infrastructure is one of the problems, heavy problems here in Barbados that entail continuous investment and sometimes, continuous investment in maintenance, which is sometimes difficult given the fiscal space. Also, we have been working with the government in a new trend that it's important in terms of infrastructure is for the digitization of the economy. We are providing more than $40 million in a very overarching project that will create the infrastructure to deliver better digitized services for citizens and businesses. That will improve the business climate of the country and will provide the necessary vehicle for long-term growth. Also, and I want to acknowledge again the presence of Daniel, we have been in this endeavor working very closely with CDB for a long time. They are doing also heavy investment in infrastructure in Barbados. We find very fitting having this presentation of the DIA because as common knowledge says, given fiscal constraints in the countries, the need for private sector investment is also important, not only the fiscal effort of the country. So bringing more and more parties to the table is essential for this endeavor. And as you will see, the DIA brings up-to-date knowledge about how to bring all these new actors, how to make sound analysis, and essentially, and this is very important, how to make all this infrastructure investment effective for the provision of services, which at the end of the day is so important for the citizens and for the companies in every given country. So it's with great pleasure that I welcome and thank our distinguished panelists, and we hope that we, as always, try to make a sound and meaningful contribution to the discussion in Barbados, a country that we are so dear, and where we really want to see infrastructure improving in the coming years. Thank you, Laura.
Thank you, Juan Carlos. For the rest of the session, we will have Tomás, Eduardo, and Andrew present some of the results of the book. And then we're going to go into a discussion with Daniel and our colleagues at IDB. At the end, we'll have some time for Q&A. Please remember that you can write in your questions, and we look forward to hearing some of your suggestions and what you have to say to us. Go ahead, Tomás.
Thank you very much, Laura. This is Eduardo. I'm going to start the presentation. I think the presentation is now, you can see it in the screen. So I'm going to get started. Thank you, Juan Carlos. Thank you, Laura. It's really a pleasure to be with you today. And thank you for the invitation to present the 2020 edition of the IDB's flagship Development in the Americas report in Barbados. We would very much rather be there than doing this virtually, but thanks to technology, we can at least be there virtually given the circumstances. This year's edition of the DIA, it's titled From Structure to Services, The Path to Better Infrastructure in Latin America and the Caribbean, and was co-edited by Andrew Powell, Tomás Serebrisky, and me. We will be sharing the presentation. I'll get started with the main messages, and then Andrew and Tomás will continue with the rest of the presentation. Let me start by summarizing the main messages of the book. The first message is that we need to shift the focus from structure to services. This means that we must focus on the software of infrastructure. This includes issues such as governance, regulation, the efficiency of providers, and consumer behavior. A second message is that Latin America and the Caribbean must invest more and invest better. There are ways to accomplish this. It can be done with the right policies today. The third message is that the future will bring disruption enabled, for example, by digitalization, with huge opportunities. But the region needs to improve connectivity and adapt policy frameworks to be able to realize those enormous potential benefits. A fourth message is that improving services can boost economic growth and reduce income inequality. This will be critical for our region, especially coming out of this COVID-19 pandemic, where we need to grow, but we need to grow also in a way that includes more people and helps reduce the impending inequality in the region. A fifth message is that explicit sustainable infrastructure and decarbonization strategies are required to address the climate challenge. And finally, a sixth message is that improving governance and ensuring regulation adapts for the future will be critical for better services for all. The rest of the presentation will be devoted to fleshing out the details of these messages and provide you with a tour d'horizon of the book. But let me go to the starting point, which is the shift in focus from structure to services. While as consumers, we use services all the time, in policy debates about infrastructure, most of the attention is on the physical assets. Structures are the hardware of the sector. Water treatment and sewage plants, electric power plants and high voltage lines, roads, train tracks, tunnels, you name it. Of course, building such structures is essential because without them, the water, energy, and transportation services could not be provided. But there is more to infrastructure than the hardware. Shifting the focus to services involves analyzing complementary issues, which we call the software of the sector, such as, for example, consumer behavior, the management of utility companies and their efficiency, and the rules by which they operate. When considering the state of services in the region, we focus on three main elements. The first element is access. Latin America and the Caribbean has made great progress in recent years in terms of access to infrastructure services. Progress is especially noticeable in terms of electric power, where most countries are close to providing universal access to this service. By the way, Barbados is at the top of the list in Latin America and the Caribbean region, having reached universal access to electricity by 2018. However, statistics about access can be misleading because the definition hinges on the standards used. The example of water and sanitation is illustrative. Nearly 96.7% of the population has access to drinking water according to the standard definition. However, that may mean a 15-minute walk from home to reach a safe water source. That percentage drops by 14 percentage points if we use a more demanding standard, such as having running water at home. Once access is available, the second element to consider is quality. This means, for example, accessing electricity without power cuts or having drinking water coming out clean and with the adequate pressure. While the region has improved the quality of services, it has not improved as much as other developing regions. And as a result, the quality gap is growing. On this dimension, like with access to basic services, Barbados scores above regional averages. Still, there is room for improvement as, according to the World Economic Forum survey on which this data is drawn, progress in terms of improving quality has slowed. Accessing quality service is of little use if people cannot afford them. In Latin America and the Caribbean, households spend more on electricity, water, transportation, and communications than peers in other regions, particularly the poor. This suggests that affordability is a barrier. In the region, many people do not consume basic services because they cannot afford them. Another example may be illustrative. Surveys show that 40% of the poor in the region make the main journey of the day by foot, while only 10% of the wealthiest do so. That would be fine if walking were a choice, but probably that is not the case for many people. The problem is more likely that the poor cannot afford the pecuniary costs of motorized transportation. And there are other examples pertaining to other services. According to estimates reported in the book, paying for a consumption basket of services that mimics the one of households in advanced economies would demand more than 40% of the income for the poor in some cities across the region. The bottom line is that for those on lower incomes, affording services is almost impossible. Let me switch now or give the floor to the screen to Andy. Thank you. Andy,
okay.
You are on mute.
Yeah, you can hear me now, right? Thanks, Eduardo. And thanks to Juan Carlos and Laura for the invitation. It's great to be with everybody today, albeit virtually. I'm going to talk about investment and then a bit about where we are going in the future and elaborate some scenarios which we give a lot more detail on in the book. And then Thomas will talk more specifically about policies and recommendations. The first point that I want to make is, as introduced by Eduardo, we need to invest more in infrastructure. We need to invest more in basic services to improve access and quality, and investing more is critical to bridging the infrastructure gap. Even before the current COVID crisis, investment in infrastructure was pretty low in Latin America and the Caribbean. It was about 2.8% of GDP on average between 2008 and 2017, well below averages in other regions, such as especially East Asia and the Pacific, and even below that of the Middle East and North Africa. So this meant that the infrastructure gap was widening in our region compared to those other regions. Public investment is low, not much more, around 2% of GDP over this period, and private investment is even lower, less than 1% of GDP on average. And the trend was declining. So the trend in both public and private investment had been declining over the recent years, with a clear bias against spending on investment and more spending on government consumption. We can maybe come back to the reasons for that and in the Q&A. One overarching conclusion that we came to in the book is that we need to invest better, and actually that the low quality of investment is also very related to the low quantity of investment. The two things are very related, and they're related because in general the investment framework needs a lot of work in the region. There's a lack of adequate planning, there's weak governance, poor implementation, and this impacts investment, whatever the delivery vehicle that's adopted, whether it be public investment or private investment. And in fact, this private sector is reticent to invest given the poor framework in some cases. So as an example, out of a sample of 200 public investment projects in Latin America and the Caribbean that we studied, 36 were canceled and 162 suffered delays. We estimated that an incredible 35% of the allocated resources may even be lost in cost overruns and delays. These were public projects. And as public investment in infrastructure is around 2%, a bit more than 2% per year, the potential saving could be as much as 0.65% of GDP per annum. That's actually a really significant quantity every year if we could get that improvement. But the bottom line is quantity and quality go in hand. There's little point in boosting investment unless the quality is good. On the other hand, if we do manage to reform to improve the quality, then that should also attract higher and especially private investment. It's particularly important at the moment, given very tight budget constraints in many countries. But let me now turn to what we refer to as the drivers of change for the future. The first one listed, social demands, has become even more urgent because of COVID-19, which is deepening the high levels of inequality in the region. The implication for infrastructure is that we need to improve quality and affordability. It's not enough to have access to a modern bus if it arrives late and it's expensive and overcrowded. And it's not enough to have a tap in the kitchen if the water quality is such that bottled water has to be bought for drinking and cooking. Most dramatically in Brazil and Chile, it was actually some hikes in the price of services that sparked protests and social unrest. So we need to be very mindful of affordability and how we can use infrastructure to improve equity as we move forward. A second big challenge is climate change. And I know this is something you're all extremely aware of in the Caribbean and in Barbados in particular. In the last 50 years, the frequency of natural disasters in the region has tripled. And the economic damage to roads, buildings, machinery, equipment, crops, and houses has soared from about an estimated $7 billion in the first decade in this graph to over $100 billion in the last decade in this graph. And yes, there's still a lively debate going on among scientists about whether the frequency or the intensity of storms will continue to rise and why that is. I mean, it's pretty clear that something's going on. The 2020 hurricane season has been unprecedented in terms of the number of named storms, as I'm sure you all know. Natural disasters affect structures and also service provision, not just storms, but other kinds of disasters too. For those countries with hydroelectric power, they cause blackouts, rainfall can pollute water and increase disease transmission, etc. So it's not just storms, it's other disasters, and they affect the provision of services and not just also the assets. It's argued very strongly in the book that time is running out, that action needs to be taken by all countries to move towards zero emissions. And I know Barbados is on that, is taking steps on that path. And for those countries, of course, subject to natural disasters, infrastructure should be resilient to those events. And there is a chapter in the book dedicated to that as well. Finally, let me turn to technology, which is a really interesting part of this story. I mean, first of all, attempting to predict the future in the face of what is really very rapid potential technological change is pretty daunting. When you start reading what might happen, it seems there are many paths that the world could take. And yeah, this is what our designers came up with to illustrate those paths, by the way. And it's pretty hard in this space to separate what's really possible from the hype, especially, you know, there are interested parties out there, they're attempting to sell their own innovation or their preferred vision. So we really thought about how to approach this, and we decided the best way was to try to construct some concrete scenarios that combine what we felt were the most likely technological advances with different policy responses. And the interesting part of this thought process was that it's clear that the policies today are going to be critical for the future. And the technological change could be an enormous force for the good, but there were also some dangers out there. So we have to be very careful. Technology and innovation come in many forms, but I just want to mention that one theme across the different sectors we can label as digitalization, in which I include connectivity, data collection and analysis, the intelligent use of that data, possibly through artificial intelligence or other techniques, and hence much better information, and the possibility to control all types of systems, machines and appliances in real time. And so that gives the ability to respond to very fine price signals, much more than we could have done so in the past, assuming, of course, that those price signals exist. And that gives you the link then to regulation. So let's just discuss electricity as a kind of example. The costs of generating solar and wind power are falling very rapidly. And I know, again, you're aware of this in Barbados, Barbados and the Caribbean and Latin America follows this trend. And in many cases, this has led to lower prices. Here's a graph about battery costs. This is how battery costs have fallen. But we could have shown you the cost of solar panels or wind turbines, where costs have also come down. This reduction in the price of renewables and the lower cost of storage, coupled with digitalization, is provoking a strong drive towards decentralization, where firms and households will increasingly generate their own energy. And I know, again, in Barbados, Barbados is taking some steps in this direction. Digitalization is actually the key to this. It's the key that opens the door for consumers to take control, to manage their demand and their supply in real time, so that today's passive consumers will become more active and intelligent prosumers. These changes have the potential really to revolutionize the market for electricity. And we need to think very carefully through this, what this means for the potential structure of markets and the role of electricity companies and their regulation. And there are some dangers here. For example, if higher income households and firms disconnect from the grid, then the system may become underfunded, and that puts investment and maintenance at risk. There's probably a bad equilibrium out there, which could be efficient for a few, but socially inefficient and more regressive. So there are some tough trade-offs on the horizon, which will require careful management. We want to allow the benefits of technology, but we want to avoid what we might call a kind of dystopian future. But we do think that with the right policies, we see a bright future where we can harness this technology, we can get clean energy, we can go for zero emissions, and even supply electricity at lower prices in remote areas. Now, in other sectors, the specific challenges are certainly different. And in the book, we discuss the challenges in transport and in water. But we also developed scenarios in the book for those sectors which follow a similar scheme. So I invite you to look at the book for further details. But the upshot is that technological advances with the wrong policies could lead to a negative scenario. But the combination of technological advances and the right public policies could yield to very significant opportunities, including for income and for distribution. So how can we try to estimate these kinds of opportunities? So in the book, we carried out some actual simulations on how technological changes in the past have impacted the economies in the region. The results suggest that technology and the digitalization of services could really strengthen economic growth. Just a 5% increase in the productive efficiency of services, which is a very modest assumption, would result in a gain of about 3.5% of GDP over 10 years. That's a really big return, actually, from a pretty modest increase in efficiency. And we think that the technological advances of the future may dwarf the advances of the past. So this could be a kind of bottom line. I mean, it's likely to be much greater than this. In addition, technological change should really support inclusive growth, as it should really improve income distribution. The simulations suggest that the income of all households would rise, but actually it's the real income of the poorer households that rise by a greater amount. Why is that? Because prices should fall. And as prices fall, the benefits are greater for poorer households because they tend to spend a greater portion of their income on these basic services. So there should be an impact not just on growth, but also on distribution or on equity. But taking advantage of these changes requires connectivity. And unfortunately, here the region really lags. And we need to be mindful of this gap. So for a large proportion of the population, getting connected is difficult as the digital infrastructure just does not exist, or connecting to it remains expensive. So we also recommend a digital agenda that is required, which includes designing a national broadband plan that facilitates open access to infrastructure and that promotes competition. Well-targeted subsidies could be part of this process to achieve universal access. And the book summarizes some examples of policies in this direction. And finally, digital education could be a very useful complement for users to take advantage of the many opportunities that technology provides. So on that, I will pass the microphone to Thomas. Thomas.
Thank you, Andy. Good afternoon to all. I will take the last part of the presentation. So closing the infrastructure gap in Latin America and the Caribbean requires an increase in both public and private investment. The role of public investment is undeniable. The challenge for the region will be to reverse the existing bias against public investment that characterizes spending policies in Latin America and the Caribbean. Given the trends that show a reduction in public investment in infrastructure, private investment must play an important role to close the infrastructure gap. Of course, private investment must take place where it makes economic sense, that is in projects with high rates of social return and where the private sector can innovate and provide better quality and more efficient services. PPP projects must take place within adequate fiscal management frameworks that value and report contingent liabilities. There is plenty of room for private investment to grow in the region. Today, commercial banks account for most of infrastructure financing, but institutional investors, which are ideal candidates to finance infrastructure, only account for 1% of total financing. In the book, we show that if they allocate 5% of their assets under management, private investment could double in the region. Commercial banks have had a leading role in infrastructure financing, especially during the construction phase of projects, as they have had the resources and the project finance skills particularly important during the construction phase. But the pressure of tighter regulations and now the COVID crisis may prevent commercial banks keeping long-term loans on their balance sheets. New investors are needed either from the start of a project or once the construction phase is complete. And once the construction phase is completed, risks decline and the nature of risks change. Bonds backed by the return of the operation of the asset could be an attractive instrument for institutional investors. Beyond the need to increase investment, the book emphasizes that the region needs to reduce the inefficiency of investment. That accounts, was mentioned previously, for at least 35% of total public investment. The way forward is to invest in the investment process. And the roadmap here includes 5 major options. First is to develop an infrastructure plan that identifies a set of policy priorities or priority projects that is key to provide predictability to the construction industry. then it's necessary to allocate sufficient resources to pre-investment. This is necessary to reduce contingencies and cost overruns. Third is to stimulate competition and innovation. For example, by moving from selection criteria based on inputs and lowest prices as the most common form of procurement in the region, to award criteria that prioritize service quality. So this is the output of infrastructure. Then we need to do a much better job to prioritize investment, maintenance. For example, with contracts that bundle road rehabilitation and maintenance, in which the region has proven experience. And we need to move from reactive to predictive maintenance, which is increasingly feasible thanks to technology. And finally, fight against corruption in infrastructure. How? By improving compliance with laws, but also through targeted interventions. And there are a few examples with digital platforms called in the region Mapa Inversiones that have been implemented in, for instance, Colombia, Peru, and Costa Rica. And these platforms allow citizens to track in real time how resources are being spent. And in terms of sustainability, infrastructure is key to mitigating the effects of climate change. Excluding emissions from land use for food production, energy generation, and transport account for 70% of the region's CO2 emissions. There can be no excuse or delays. To comply with the Paris Agreement, infrastructure provision must change today. And there is a consensus among specialists on 4 pillars to move Latin America and the Caribbean to a net zero carbon economy. It's generate electricity from renewable sources, massively electrify industrial and residential activities and foster energy efficiency, increase the use of public and non-motorized transportation, and restore ecosystems with high carbon absorption. And simultaneously with mitigation, adaptation should be a policy priority. Many engineering options can make infrastructure more resilient. Building resilient structures, assets, such as elevating roads, adds on average 5% to project costs. These additional costs are offset by lower maintenance and repair costs and by avoiding the impact of interrupting services. The 5% of a multi-million-dollar project is a lot, but compared with the 35% that is lost through inefficient investment, it is very little. Now going to a key component of the book and policy recommendation, that is regulation. Regulation is key for dividends of technological change to reach all consumers. Efficiency improvements will not lead by themselves to lower prices in many infrastructure markets. Utilities tend to be monopolies, and free to their own will would capture all the efficiency gains. That is, in economic terms, there would be a markup, that is a wedge between prices and costs. And should that be the case, we show in the book that the impact of efficiency gains, which without markups, as Andy showed, could generate up to 3.5% of incremental growth over 10 years, would drop to about half, just 1.8% if a markup is allowed. So a good example of how countries are striving to update their regulatory framework is the adoption of net metering policies. It's necessary for trading energy between prosumers and utilities. As of 2019, almost all countries in the region had approved these policies. Barbados was an early adopter of policies to facilitate distributed energy sources, and the FTC issued new rules in late 2019 that sets the conditions for exchange of energy between providers and the utility company BL&P. But there are many regulatory policies that hinder the efficiency of services. There are labor regulations, barriers to competition, and procurement rules that discourage innovation. The graph here shows an example from the commercial air transport. Regulations force airlines in Latin America to have 25% more crew than in the US to operate the same quantity of flights, which translates, of course, into higher costs for airlines in the region. Clearly, this regulation cannot be justified on safety grounds. So what is clear is that going forward, regulatory frameworks must adapt to changing times. The status quo in place since the 1990s has been to have independent regulators, in most of the cases, one per service. But the boundaries among sectors are blurring. Electricity, for instance, is increasingly interrelated with transport, water, and telecommunications. An example of this nexus is illustrative. Electric vehicles are batteries on wheels. So how electricity storage and flows are regulated will determine the adoption of electric vehicles. And this in turn will affect investment needs in the electricity distribution network. This is why collaboration between regulatory institutions has become more important than ever. Sectoral mandates may need to be reassigned, agencies could be merged, and data management supervision could be allocated to a new data agency. The best solution will, of course, depend on the context of each country. But what is clear is that it will be necessary to foster competition, enhance governance, adopt new policies, and rethink instruments and institutions. So let me conclude by saying that in the interest of time, this presentation is a very summarized overview of what is in the book, and there is a lot more detail in the book and supporting material. The book is available to be downloaded in the link that we provide in this slide. So thank you very much for listening, and looking forward to your questions and comments. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Tomás, Eduardo, and Andrew. It's always wonderful to have you with us. For everybody connected, there's a link to the publication. Please go ahead, download it. It's a fantastic publication, really rich. And it's definitely given us a lot of food for thought this morning. Now I'd like to give word to Daniel Best, who is Director of Projects at the Caribbean Development Bank, and an eminence, if you don't mind me saying, Daniel, in project management and actually building infrastructure with the Caribbean Development Bank, which is a major player in infrastructure financing, both in Barbados and in the Caribbean. And I wanted to kick off with a question to you, Daniel, which is, what is your experience? We've had this wonderful presentation with theoretical context, links to the economy, to poverty, to emissions. What are these, for you, what are the challenges, but what are the rewards, and what do we get out of investing in infrastructure, particularly resilience infrastructure in the Caribbean?
Yeah, thank you. Thank you so much, Laura, for the invitation, and the IDB team. Thank you, my good friend Juan Carlos, for the kind words, and thanks to the team that just presented. What an excellent presentation. And I've started reading the text myself. You know, in looking at the text, going through the executive summary, I was struck first off by the story of Maria Fernanda and her journey from home to work in an idyllic future, using sustainable transportation, etc. And just to bring that back to your question, Laura, you know, there are a number of areas we can go in. I mean, obviously, we know the maintenance challenges within the region. We know that our region, 8 of the 10 most vulnerable countries in the world to climate change are in our neighborhood. But I want to go in a slightly different route, and I think it may have been Andrew that touched on this. That is the aspect of data. One of the main challenges we have in our region is the absence of regional data sets that can inform, and I'm talking about the Caribbean in particular, that can inform evidence-based decision-making as it relates to infrastructure. And I want to come back to the story of Maria Fernanda, because we at the Caribbean Development Bank, and I know the IDB, we view infrastructure through social lenses. How can the infrastructure impact lives, livelihoods, and life chances? And how the interconnectedness of infrastructure with data, I think, is the direction our region needs to be a little more aggressive in. I mean, obviously, I'm here in Barbados, and I want to commend the government for taking the jump with respect to the EV buses. That's certainly a step in the right direction. But intelligent transport systems, for instance, if I could just touch on that. We in the Caribbean, we don't have the land space to continuously expand the road network in our region. And therefore, what are we going to do to provide improved quality of service to the traveling public? And for this to happen, we need intelligent transport systems incorporated into all of the decision making of the ministries of transport and works across the region. Because of course they benefit significantly the traffic, non-motorized public and pedestrians. They significantly reduce the risk of pedestrian and motorized accidents and fatalities, etc. And of course, speed control and improved parking, circulation, and movement are also benefits of this. The other point I want to touch on, if I can move from transport just briefly, and look at energy usage, as Juan Carlos would have mentioned in his intervention. There is, of course, the LED lights, the street lighting projects, which both IDB and CDB are doing. But how can we extend that into the area of citizen security, considering, again, the social aspects of it? And one of the things that we have sought to do is incorporate smart metering into the LED street lamps, because within the LED street lamps, you have a network that maps many of the urban centers of our region. And so utilizing an intelligent system through smart metering, what we do is we're able to, one, of course, provide significantly increased quality of service, such that if there's an outage of a streetlight in any area, there is real-time data passed to the various utilities, electrical utilities in the region. Of course, there's also the opportunity to dim and put security lamps, security cameras, sorry, on these street lights, which of course could be used for police services, urban planning, etc. So there's that aspect of it as well. There's just one other one I want to touch on, and that is the issue of trade. One of the things we're doing now, we're going to be taking to our board, is a port community system for the Barbados port here. And what it does, of course, is an incorporation of multiple systems operated by the port. And when fully operational, what it will do is facilitate improved berth management. The maritime single window will be a part of it, and e-payment. And if anyone has ever had to deal with a port in our region, we know sometimes it could be a little challenging. But eventually, you know, users of the port systems will get to a stage where there's a one-time submission of documentation. Now, this directly impacts micro, small, and medium enterprises that struggle to import essential components to their businesses into our islands. And finally, of course, we've spoken about climate variability and change and the adverse impact that it's had on our region. And the importance of regional data sets, and I mean regional data sets, not downscaling data sets for the region, but developing regional data sets to inform how we treat with our infrastructure, both in the design and maintenance of infrastructure in the region is absolutely critical. We're doing some great work with the Caribbean Institute of Meteorology and Hydrology, and of course the 5 Cs in Belize, out of Belize. But this needs to be rolled out, I think, across certainly the Caribbean region. Just speaking, of course, from the CDB perspective. So that would be my initial take. I know it was a bit long, I'm sorry, but I think this is really quite exciting stuff, and I want to commend the team for doing this, because I think it presents an opportunity to focus minds on the service aspect of infrastructure as opposed to just the structures. I'm coming from an engineer that's saying a lot, so thank you.
Thank you, Daniel. Not long at all. Wonderful examples. And it kind of touches on some points that the team have been discussing, right? Which is infrastructure at the end of the day lies at the heart of growth and development processes in a country, and really touches on many other sectors and aspects of people's lives. I'd like to remind participants to please post your questions in the Q&A. I'm going to ask one more question and then move on to some of the questions we have received from our audience. And I'm going to throw this question to all four of you and see what each of you can wants to say or comes up with. As pointed out, Barbados has good access to infrastructure. It has good level of infrastructure by regional standards and has good access. But how do we improve the quality? So we're not facing a problem here that people can't get the service, but how do we as institutions and the government in its mandate improve the quality of service that Barbadian citizens are getting? Whoever wants to go first, get one. Go ahead, Niall.
Maybe I could take a stab at this and then, yeah. I want to come back to the use of technology and data. So for instance, water. I think we do have universal coverage for water in the island. Largely, yes, there are some pockets where we have some challenges. But one of the projects we're funding here, the supply network and upgrading project, where we're going to be installing a SCADA system to monitor the quality of water actually supplied, to monitor outages such that crews can get outages in real time, such that crews can get this information and go to the source. Similarly with street lighting, knowing when street lights may be off in any particular area and responding accordingly. These things have very real social and citizen security implications. Women who travel on buses late at night and have to, take the children and walk home in darkness, especially in urban centers, it's important that our utilities and those who manage the infrastructure in our country are fed with real-time information, not just, of course, for monitoring and responding, but in terms of maintenance and improving the quality of that output and by extension, therefore, the outcome on the citizenry of our island. That would be my take on that.
Let me, if I may, just
please go ahead, Thomas.
Well, I can't agree more with Daniel, with what he said. But also, let me go back to something that he said that I think is very, very important, that is a lack of data for decision making. Just to maybe share an announcement that as a result of this research and the challenges that we face to produce the book, the IDB will launch observatories, data observatories, one for water, one for transport, one for energy. The energy was just launched. The name is Energy Hub. So there's plenty of information. And then we have another platform for investment in infrastructure that is called InfraLatam. There is a joint work with CAF and ECLAC. So just to complement what Daniel said, another potential gain for the provision of better services could be improving the efficiency of service providers, and that's for instance, setting up or putting in place adequate regulatory incentives to reduce technical and commercial losses and increase productivity. And then also, and technology is helping us here. We are a particular moment in time that technology will help us to give incentives to end users to make more efficient use of services. And this can be achieved by use of pricing incentives, but coupled with technological tools to implement what is known as demand response programs. And this could lead clearly to win-win situations and help households adopt, Internet of Things and smart sensors. That's the way forward.
Any further comments, Eduardo or Andrew? Should we go to the next question?
Very briefly,
Of course.
Laura, on the issue of how to improve quality, I think one thing that we stress in the book, and I want to highlight here, is the shift in focus from structure to services. And I think that has to do also with the dimension about, or that provides a hint about how to tackle the issue of quality. Because when you put when you look at services, you have to put the consumer at the forefront of the debates. And that's a critical element in this sector. We have paid too much attention to the structure. Sometimes we have not paid as much attention to the receiving end of that equation, which is the consumer, how to provide a better experience to the consumer, how to incorporate the consumer into the equation, how to use technology adequately, how to provide for more competition so that prices for consumers can go down, and so on and so forth. So I think really looking at the issue from the side of the services and putting the consumer at the forefront, it's one way in which countries have and can actually implement policies to improve quality.
Absolutely right.
Yeah, just to say, I agree with all of the above. By the way, particularly on the data issue, I mean, not just Barbados and the Caribbean, but there is a problem of data everywhere, which is why, as Thomas said, these observatories are particularly interesting, not just in the Caribbean, but in other countries in the region as well. And it was a challenge to write this book in many respects. It's hard to get fundamental data on many things, including on the ongoing performance of infrastructure projects. It's easy to get data on what their plans were and how much money was invested originally, but it's hard to get information about what was the outcomes. Did these projects actually succeed? Did they result in good services down, as Eduardo said, for consumers? I mean, it's very hard to get this information, and we need to invest in this information much more in all countries.
Absolutely, I could not agree more. I know that IDB does a lot of effort in evaluating its programs, which gives an example and starts in that way. Also making it publicly available. I personally don't find that there's a lot of publicly available information on how some of these programs work. I'm going to now go into our Q&A from our audience. We've got a question from Robin, and I think this one's for you, Andrew. So he asks, wouldn't you expect a higher proportion of GDP to be expended on infrastructure in rapidly urbanizing Africa and East Asia than in already highly urbanized Latin America and the Caribbean? I think this is with respect to that comment on other areas in the world that you said in your presentation.
Well, it's an interesting question. I mean, I think not necessarily is the answer. But let me say a bit more. I mean, I'm not sure, I mean, what you expect is one thing, but I mean, I think the underlying point that we make in the book, and which we underline, is we're spending too little on infrastructure. So let's just be clear: we're spending too little on infrastructure in Latin America and in the Caribbean. I mean, I think all evidence points to this. And if you compare countries that look more like Latin America, let's say around the world, that have been successful, especially in Asia, they spend more on infrastructure, and all of the estimates in the book, and Eduardo can talk more about this because he did most of it, show that investing in infrastructure can boost growth and also boost equity. So, we're spending too little. Now we can have discussions. Yeah, I mean, countries. We have some very large countries in Latin America that have remote areas. So of course, you need a lot of roads, you need a lot of transmission lines, and small countries are different, and urbanized countries are different. But the demands don't go down. I mean, in the very large urban centers in Latin America, we have huge infrastructure deficiencies. I mean, congestion is we have 10 of the largest, most congested cities in the world, in Latin America. So, we can argue about these relative things. That's fine. The priorities change. I completely agree with that. But I mean, the bottom line is we're spending too little on infrastructure. We need to find ways to spend more and spend better on infrastructure.
Thank you, Andrew. Another question from our audience. Is the issue of maintenance and planning really treated in the publication? I know it's a really hard area to get data from. So just building on what we were saying here. Is there any analysis done on that front?
Yeah, I think Thomas is our expert here. No?
The book places, it has one chapter that details the importance and highlights the importance of planning. It's absolutely necessary, particularly because we, as Andy was explaining, we don't invest enough in infrastructure. So we have to make sure that what we invest is really gets the highest rates of return. Planning is absolutely critical always, because infrastructure is all about networks. So we have to really complete the networks. It doesn't make any sense to build here and there. And now it's even more important due to climate change. So we need to include the sustainability element of planning upstream before we even start building. That is, in the planning stage, we need to include both the mitigation and adaptation dimensions. And of course, maintenance is critical. And the good news is that with respect to maintenance, is that technology is giving us many opportunities. As Daniel was saying, say, for instance, technology will help us identify water losses and reduce the cost to repair them. So, and there is an ongoing materials transformation revolution that will reduce the cost of building new roads, for instance. So, yeah, the book, in particular, chapter 2 and 3, have a lot to say on this.
And one last question that's been posed by the audience, and I'm just going to add one more layer to it. And I'm going to ask this to Daniel and Andrew. There's an issue with financing infrastructure. And this is the never-ending question. It's sort of it's like it's a money pot that we keep pouring money into, and it just never seems to be enough. And this is of extreme importance in Barbados because we've got an IMF program, and particularly with COVID-19, the fiscal space to be able to invest has reduced substantially. What role do both private sector but also development banks such as the CDB and IDB have, do you think, going forward? And how can we really foster more of a role for these actors and a better role for these actors?
Danielle, please go ahead.
I was going to let you answer that one, Andy. No, that's not an easy. It's a very great question, but it's not an easy one. I think governments are mandated to provide services. Yeah. Not necessarily the structures, but they are mandated to ensure that the citizenry and the residents of any sovereign entity has access to quality services. And as such, and I really appreciate what the team has done here, because once we have that mindset, the question then becomes, does the government need to own the structures, or do they need, again, to ensure that the service is adequately provided? And it's on that basis that the discussion then evolves into private-public partnerships that benefit the government and also is attractive and appropriately incentivized to the private sector. Jamaica has been the leading country in the Caribbean anyway, in the area of PPPs, successful PPPs. We are in discussions with some private entities in Jamaica now, looking at services in a few areas, and water being one of them. But again, once there is that appropriate incentive in place for the private, and the policy matrix to support it, for the private sector to become involved, where there's certain standards of quality provided, then I think that is the direction that many of our administrations will have to go in. The other point, of course, which I want to touch on, and you mentioned it, as it relates to constantly pouring money into infrastructure and how the IFIs, such as our organizations, come into play here, is the importance of, and Thomas mentioned, the importance of building in climate resilience in the design phase. The incremental increase in costs for ensuring that, for undertaking vulnerability assessments in the engineering design and building that into the hard infrastructure far outweighs the risk of what happens in the event of a disaster. The climate science works. And so I think it is imperative of MDBs such as ours. I mean, for CDB, for instance, all capital projects go through climate risk screening before going to our board to ensure that whether there's a school or agriculture project, to ensure that the design has incorporated that, because that in itself leads to sustainability and reduce maintenance costs and replacement costs down the road. So I think that marriage of the private sector, the services provided by the government, and also the upfront capital outlay to incorporate resilience is critical to successful infrastructure development and planning and development. Thank you.
Can I add to that? I mean, I like that answer. I think I agree with everything that Danielle has said. It's a very nice way of putting it. You know, I think that there are many countries that are very constrained at the moment fiscally. So there's a natural tendency to look at other ways of financing infrastructure, which may be off the government's balance sheet. And I think that has a role. In the book, we're careful to make this distinction, which is a little bit the same as Danielle was saying. I mean, it's the government's role to provide these services. One question is who actually funds these services, this in the end. So that could be the government through subsidies, or it could be the final consumer paying tariffs, or it could be, you know, companies buying their electricity or whatever. So who actually funds this project eventually? That's different to who finances it up front, right? So it could be financed by the private sector, it could be financed by the government, but who pays for it in the end? Those are two separate things. Now, we're, you know, I think in the book we take a sort of level playing field approach. We're not necessarily in favor of public or private provision, and of course, even if it's public provision, normally it's procured by a private firm, so it's just a different delivery mechanism. It's through a procurement system rather than through a PPP. You know, I don't want to get into all the details, but you know, the private sector is often involved anyway. What's crucial in this is the devil's in the details. It's the way the contracts are written and the way that the project is run and the way that the project is monitored, right? So PPPs or some variant. I mean, PPP has become a kind of a name, but there are different variants within this umbrella. But what is crucial is to make sure that that people have the right incentives and that there's good monitoring in place, right? So for example, the firm that's actually, it's good for the firm that's actually building the road or building whatever it is to have some skin in the game, that they, you know, they benefit from a good project being delivered on a timely basis, right? So then that gives them the incentives to perform as they should, right? Rather than shirk on the job, as sometimes us economists put it. Banks have become, in many countries, have been very adept at monitoring. So you find that banks particularly finance the construction phase, as Thomas was explaining a little bit in the presentation. They put up money to finance the construction phase because they have project finance expertise and they're pretty good at monitoring, and they work on a continual basis with these firms who are the sponsors, who are the builders of the project. So they have a reputation to maintain with the bank, and they have a relationship to maintain. So it keeps the incentives correct and the monitoring in place. So it's good to harness these. You know, what we need a structure whereby we can harness these kind of characteristics. So we have people in place who have the right incentives to perform, and we have people who are monitoring those who have the right incentives to monitor. And the financing structure is simply a way to try to put those pieces together. But the fundamental is to make sure people have the right incentives, and also that guys, you know, that the financiers are carrying the right risks. So banks are good at carrying some risks. Asset managers are good at carrying other risks. So, you know, that's another dimension.
Thank you, Andrew and Daniel. So with this, we are 5 minutes over the time. And I just want to say thank you so much for a wonderful presentation today. And for our guest, Daniel, who's here, been talking with us about his perspective in the Caribbean Development Bank. And thank you to all our audience for coming. It's been an intense and interesting discussion, a lot of food for thought. Please download the publication. And just a bit of a last thought before we wrap up today is infrastructure investment is not important in and of itself. The importance of it is to provide services and put the consumer first. 3 key words I think I take out of this, repeating from the presentation, are access, quality, and affordability. And both IDB and Caribbean Development Bank have this in mind and in goals in our projects. Thank you very much for joining us today, and hope to hear from everybody soon.
Thank you.